You are listening to GeekFest Rants on the IC Robots Radio Network.
You have located GeekFest Rants, the entertainment podcast for genre geeks like you.
Shall we play a game?
Covering the world of vintage and current film and television since 2010.
Game over, man. It's game over.
Featuring in-depth conversations on sci-fi, horror, fantasy, comics, toys, and conventions.
So say we all. So say we all.
And now sit back, relax, and enjoy today's show.
I've had a lot of strange experiences after all these years in the film business, but I have to say the Fantastic Four ranks somewhere near the top.
It's clobbering time.
Like a phantom, this film.
Strange.
It was like a feeling that I've never experienced before. It's a piece of history.
I never would have thought that, what is it, 20 years later, that I'd be sitting here talking about it.
This thing just won't die.
Expect trouble.
I didn't know then, all of the machinery that had been at work.
It was the seedy, dark side of Hollywood.
We really wanted people to see this.
How many movies did Roger Corman make and never release? 1.
Wait a minute. Why? We're going to let them take this movie away from us and not get anything out of it? We got to show people that we made a movie. That's how you get another job.
All this effort, time, and all the work that went into making that film, and that pointless, meaningless.
This film was never really intended to be a film. And I said, oh yeah? You watch.
I think this documentary I think it's about time.
Hopefully, we might be like the last piece of this whole puzzle. The great, untold, never-seen version, the original Fantastic Four.
Finally, after 20 years, this story is going to get told.
Unfortunately, this version of the Fantastic Four really was doomed.
Hi there, and welcome to GeekFest Rants. My name is Carlos Perron, and today we are going to be diving into film documentaries. Specifically, documentaries that have something to do with film, but not necessarily kind of like making of documentaries. There's all different types out there, and we're going to cover quite a number of them. Some of them are kind of sad, some of them are kind of funny. Some of them you're going to learn stuff that it's just baffling how crazy the behind the scenes drama that takes place, on some of these films. And some of them are even films that never got made. And it's a documentary having to do with how these films kind of fell apart. So let's begin our film documentary episode with the documentary Doomed.
What did I teach you?
You are the Duke of New York. You're a number one.
You will not laugh. You will not cry. You will learn by the numbers. I will teach you.
Can you dig it?
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
That spawn of Satan.
Oh, really?
The Force will be with you, always.
Today we're going to take a quick look at some documentaries, specifically documentaries that have to do with filmmaking. Now, I've covered some of these in the past, briefly or extensively. The one that I can think of that comes to mind very recently is Lost Soul, the one about the making of The Island of Dr. Moreau and how the crazy behind-the-scenes shenanigans going on are more interesting than the actual movie that were made. But what I have here is a list of many, many other films, some of them that I saw pretty recently, some of them that I've seen, over a long period of time, and how, some of these stories are they just kind of come out of nowhere, and they're really, really interesting. And just like this other one, sometimes they're more interesting than the film itself. Now, what differentiates most of these documentaries is that yes, when you do have a film, many times, not always, but many times, you will have an official making of documentary. Now, in the past, I've grown up with more formal making of documentaries, and they seem to come in different fashions. Back in the 80s, when you had a really, really big film, and to me, what comes to mind automatically is Star Wars, Raiders of the Lost Ark, those kind of films, where they were such high-profile films, especially by the time you got to Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, because, Star Wars exploded without much preparation for it. What would happen is that they would have a crew, a behind-the-scenes crew. At least they were smart enough to try to document what was happening behind the scenes for potential, marketing purposes and that sort of thing. Now, granted, again, by the time we get to Empire Strikes Back, they know they got a gold mine on their hands. Even Raiders of the Lost Ark, because of the track record of these two previous films, the directors involved and all that stuff, they know that this is going to be big. They do have camera crews, behind the scenes, documenting the making of and that kind of thing. And back then, anyway, for something that huge, there might have been others, I just can't remember them, but definitely there was the making of Empire Strikes Back. I know there was a making of Star Wars. I'm not sure how and when it came out. Obviously, it came out afterwards because, you don't have that much precognition of how big this film is going to be. And the quality of it is a little less, if you will. They don't have that much archival material other than, scrapped scenes or deleted scenes or alternate takes and that kind of stuff. But, when they moved on forward, they realized we better start documenting this for the sake of posterity and for the sake of, again, marketing and future films. It's good to have this type of stuff. So the way that I've seen these documentaries was on TV, I believe. CBS might have been the one that had the making of Empire, the special effects and all that, especially the special effects documentary on Empire Strikes Back. Raiders of the Lost Ark had one. I believe Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom might have had one too. Maybe it was a PBS one. I'm not entirely sure. For Return of the Jedi, there was a CBS hour-long one, I believe. I remember Billy D. Williams hosted. The Empire one was hosted by Mark Hamill. And there was a PBS Star Wars around the time of Jedi called From Star Wars to Jedi, I think, The Making of a Saga, which was like a 2-hour-long, even longer, huge documentary trying to cover the entire saga, obviously. And those were those big, big ones that I remember as far as documentaries having to do with film. Then what you also had was on cable, especially HBO, I think, they would run these very short, again, because they have time to do filler. You would have to fill airtime between movies. And the movies, you don't want them starting at, 2:39 in the afternoon. No, the movies, they tried to kind of start them on the hour or on the half hour kind of thing. So they kind of started at a decent locked time. So they would fill in between with these little segment type of things. And a lot of times I remember they used to do behind the scenes. They would have these little behind the scenes type of stuff, the making of whatever it is that you're about to show or just showed, or something that has nothing to do with whatever is before or after that. And that kind of material would also find its way to DVDs later. Not so much VHS, but DVDs. When you had DVD revolution take place, which again was pre-staged by Laserdiscs, the concept of supplemental material started to kind of permeate home video. And all these kind of behind-the-scenes things started popping up into the DVDs, supplemental materials, the bonus materials. Sometimes they would be coincidental in terms of, well, you know what, let's take all of our press kit material, the press kits, which used to be delivered to the television stations, cable stations, and all that stuff, which in the past used to just be printed material, maybe a few slides, and then later on turned into full-blown videos, an hour-long video of interviews that could be used as B-roll material, to put together a segment. And in those videos, you might find a short or not so short documentary specifically made for the press kit, that then, again, the TV stations could use as B-roll. While they're talking about the movie, they showed scenes of the documentaries and that sort of thing, the trailers, interviews, and all that kind of junk. those would find their way into these DVDs, supplemental material, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes they would exclusively make documentaries that would go on the DVDs. Future releases of Star Wars had tons of those documentaries. By the time we got to the prequels, yes, I believe there was one making of Phantom Menace that was released possibly on Fox, because by then I think Fox was already involved on the television side. But later on, for Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, they kind of skipped TV altogether. And whatever documentaries I believe were put together, they went straight to the DVD. However, once again, here we're talking about promotional documentaries on the making of the film. And that's something that's standard now. It's really, there's a reason for that, for putting those together. It's part of the package of your DVD now. There really is I can't really think of any current modern television phenomenon or movie phenomenon where you would require, or it would be profitable to put together a making of film or DVD or documentary or something that would air on television. There just is no interest anymore in that sort of thing, for you to focus on it as a broadcast network type of event. So now the way we see these making ofs are only, for home video, most likely. However, with this said, there's still tons and tons of documentaries that are out there that take a different view of the whole concept of documentaries having to do with films. So, for example, like I said earlier, we looked at Lost Souls a number of episodes ago about the behind the scenes of the making of that film and what a disaster and an insane story with the director and everything. There is a couple more that kind of fall under that condition or subgenre of documentary. One of them is called Doomed. Now, Doomed was the story, or is the story, of the making of the Fantastic Four, but not the Fox Fantastic Four films that have recently been put out, and not so recently, but the one that came before that, which was one that was put together by Roger Corman, famous movie producer, super low budget, quantity, not quality kind of guy, And this is a movie that was put together in the early 90s. This is a period where Marvel Marvel was not what it was now. DC was the only major studio that had some success, with superhero films. We're talking about, if you go back to the 70s, you could take Superman films, through the 80s. Then you had Batman, with its initial strong run and then kind of declining run. But up to that point, Marvel was just a mess. Anything they did was most likely ending up in television. I don't know if it had barely made it to film. There was a Spider-Man TV show. There was a Hulk TV show, The Incredible Hulk. There actually was a Captain America horrible, horrible film. We talked about this way, way in the past. Even Thor made a cameo appearance. There were a number of attempts. So up to this point, they just were not getting there. They were just not hitting any, home runs on this thing. However, in the horizon, there was chatter of James Cameron possibly doing Spider-Man and, some other big heavy hitters possibly starting to tap into other Marvel properties. I think even Black Panther, Wesley Snipes was possibly involved in they might be making a Black Panther version, and they even mentioned a Doctor Strange version of a Marvel adaptation that was kind of bubbling up out there. But up to this point, they had nothing. They had absolutely nothing. So what happened is that up to this point, Marvel had been kind of leasing out, or I don't know what you call it, renting out, leasing, optioning the rights. That's what they call it, optioning the rights to do some of these characters. And for whatever reason, Roger Corman and another company, they hit upon, or they got the rights to do Fantastic Four. And the thing about it was that the conditions of making this film, the fact that you're doing a Roger Corman film, already you kind of should know that there's something going to be a little not great about it because they're low-budget films. You cannot expect, super quality material out of a Roger Corman production. But because they were teaming up with this other company, and, they did have the rights from Marvel, off the bat, they went running and started hiring people, constructing sets or reusing sets. More likely, Corman was the king of the recycled sets from his previous productions, and all the actors and the director, everybody's gun ho about it, and they start shooting this thing. But there was some kind of a clause that said that they had to start, or at least they had to begin putting this movie together before the end of the year. So the movie is put together under low budget conditions, and everybody is working super hard so that they can have, I guess a summer release, hopefully, or the following year. And little by little, they start to realize that the producers, the distributors and everybody is kind of starting to slowly back away from it. They finish shooting barely. They don't feel like they've gotten everything they needed, as a lot of times people do. And by the time it's all said and done, they're maybe 2 weeks away from releasing the film, and they pull the plug on it. And they get notice that, Corman and his distributors are not going to do it. They're going to just shelve the film. And later it's found out that Marvel, because, now this is something that's still kind of questionable to a certain extent, but it looks that way. It looks like because Marvel was looking forward to hopefully starting their own, let's say, franchise, what they have now, what they didn't have it back then, in the 90s, that they wanted to get the rights back. Not only did they want to get the rights back, but they wanted to make sure that nothing else was put out so that it wouldn't sour people on the look of it. Granted, you put out a Roger Corman version of anything, and it's just not going to leave a good taste in your mouth. So the thing about this documentary is that it implies, and it's probably true, that behind the scenes, Marvel gave Corman a big chunk of money to say, okay, we're done with the movie. It's edited. It's ready to go, but we're not going to release it. We're just going to put it in a vault somewhere, which upset everybody, below the line of the high up producers, the Corman types. So, the director and the stars, and they're all completely devastated, heartbroken because they put so much hard work into it, and the whole thing just kind of went away. And a lot of them do kind of, looking back, they kind of say that, the writing was a little bit on the wall in terms of how, certain things weren't happening, and there were signs of just unusual behavior having to do with how the movie was being put together. But they also kind of chalked it off to low budget production, Roger Corman. It's also questionable whether or not Roger Corman was committed from the beginning to making this film and putting it out there, or was it all just a game between him and Marvel to try to get Marvel to offer him money to pull the plug on the film? So he kind of kept continuing the film going, hoping that at some point Marvel will say, all right, here's a couple of $1 million or whatever, and just stop everything and give us the rights back, and let's all go on our merry little ways. Who knows? I don't think anybody will admit to that exactly. Suffice it to say that the guy in charge of Marvel at that point got the deal done. Everything worked out for the Marvel side, and these guys just moved on to other roles in their, throughout their careers. But this does fall under that condition of a film that just never made it, never got made, and ironically, it made its way to the convention circuit in terms of bootlegs, and you could buy a bad copy version of it, which is bad to begin with, made it even worse. And some of them actors are even saying, on the interviews, like, this movie has probably gotten more people to see it because of the controversy of it not being allowed to be played than if it would have been played in the first place. It has become such a mysterious thing that more people want to see it now than they probably ever would have if it was released. Very, very interesting documentary. Really, really, again, it's one of these behind the scenes kind of like, what the hell is happening, while this movie's being made. It's really, really, really interesting. The other one that I want to talk about that also falls under that category of films that were not made is The Death of Superman Lives. Well, this is one that, again, a number of years ago, I remember YouTube videos would have popped up somewhere having to do with some costume fittings of Nick Cage, out of all people, dressed up as Superman, where he was actually involved in the possible making of a Superman film. This is before Superman Returns. Superman Returns actually came from this failed attempt at making a Superman film. What's happening here at this point is you have the end of the Batman era. The Batman films are pretty much winding down. You know, the original Burton films now exchanged hands. They're Joe Schumacher, you know, different Batmans, different directors, that sort of thing. And they are looking to see if they could come up with Superman this time around. You know, Superman was there in the past. They wanted to make him different. And there were apparently 3 different writers that took a crack at the script, including Kevin Smith. He was the first writer. He was, again, on his, second, third, fourth film and still writing. So I think John Peters was the producer, big shot producer, a character in himself. Somehow Smith is hired and he puts together his version of Superman. And in a way, they're trying to also do it a little different in terms of, just like Batman, that kind of got it out of the campy 60s vision of it. And with Batman, they tried to go darker, and they did go darker, not as dark as nowadays or even Nolan, but they did change it. But with Superman, they wanted to do something like that too. They didn't want to do a repeat of the Christopher Reeve Superman, so Kevin Smith puts together his version of it, and there is some friction noticeable because of the interviews between Smith and Peters. Peters apparently just likes some of the stuff, doesn't like some of the stuff that Smith puts together, and then at a certain point, the whole thing is handed over back to Burton. And Burton, again, he's got his clout from Batman. They want him to kind of recreate that magic that he did with Batman, but now do it with Superman. And for some reason, he was interested. He wanted to do something different. But again, going back to that genre. So he kind of takes the Smith script and keeps a few items, very few of them, but does it a different way with another writer. So he's now running along in the process, getting closer and closer to, what it is that they're trying to do. And by this point, he's doing a lot of conceptual drawings. He's got people drawing like crazy, models, drawings, sketches, that kind of thing. And somehow they hook up with Nick Cage. The studio decides that Nick Cage is a good candidate for this. Not the person that everybody would have thought of, but just like Batman, Michael Keaton was also not the person everybody was thinking of, at least the general public or the fans. There was backlash, I remember, and they talk about it. Even though the internet wasn't around yet to that extent, there was a lot of fan backlash that eventually they warmed up to him. But at first, everybody was like, what? Michael Keaton? This is like, the guy from Gun Home, Mr. Mom. What is he going to do? But that was kind of what they were hoping with Nicolas Cage in terms of, he's a wild, crazy kind of actor. He had just done some darker material. So they were thinking, well, maybe that's where we can tap into. That's what we're looking at. Now, keep in mind, Nick Cage already had a pretty receding hairline back then, but they were going to have to put a wig on him more or less because this Superman was also based more on the certain batch of comics that they were looking at. You're dealing with a Superman that is older, that is different. He's got long hair, and at some point in the comics, he dies, and then, they were trying all kinds of things to kind of spruce up the story. But in this particular story, it involves him dying and then coming back to life again, which is the whole title, which was supposed to be Superman Lives, which is the one that Smith had kind of cobbled together. So, again, a lot of this is driven by these strange footage that had started to surface and pictures of Cage doing a costume fitting test where he's got this weird Superman outfit on. It's a different color. It's got lights. It's got all kinds of weird things. And it is even talked about during a segment in the documentary where the host, the guy who's actually interviewing everybody in the documentary, he talks about how at the Superman Returns shooting, there was some kind of an argument at some point, and that Singer, the director, he opens up his notes and his books, and he has a large picture of Nicolas Cage in the costume. And he's kind of showing it to somebody saying, this is why, we're doing it my way, because we don't want it to look like this. This is why it can't look like that. So it was something that had been circulating for a while, and people on the inside kind of knew about it. And they were making fun of it even back then. And then later on, again, when this footage started circulating on YouTube, that's when people were like, what is this? What the heck is this all about? So a lot of the documentary focuses on how, detailed Tim Burton was into this and how much work he put into it. And then the weird back and forth with Peters and the studios and everything else. And it gets to a point at this stage where they actually bring in a third writer, and sooner or later, even Burton completely loses control because they pull the plug on the whole thing. The studios decide they have too many bombs. They have had so many bombs that they didn't want to spend any extra money on it. They were already budgeting this to be a huge budget, and that's when they pull the plug, and everybody kind of goes home at that point. So that pretty much wraps up the story in terms of, another one of these movies that never got made because the studio at the last minute backed out. A lot of people are left disappointed. Multiple writers are tweaking the story and changing it and that sort of things. Some of the elements you could say kind of found their way to Superman Returns. But overall, the concept or the idea that you could have had somebody like Nick Cage portraying Superman in a completely different looking thing that you've never seen before is something, in Hollywood legend, but it's real. It's there. You can look it up and take a look at for yourself to see. And what's really important is to see the early concept thoughts of how between the actor and the director, they're kind of massaging the ideas of, well, he could do this, he could do that, he could be more of this, he could be more of that. It is difficult to kind of say to yourself, how could you put Nick Cage? He was too well known back then. He's still too well known now. You gotta more or less always put an actor that's not very well known, and that's what they've done in the past, even with Superman Returns, which wasn't a hit or anything. But Christopher Reeve wasn't that well known. Roth, I think that's his last name, the guy who did the Return, and even now with the more recent ones, Henry Cavill, he wasn't pretty well known anyway. So yeah, it does help when he's not very well known, and I just think it would have been a little weird. Now, granted, this is the same thing people might have been saying about Michael Keaton, and he turned out to be pretty good. So, yeah, it's out there. It's a possibility that it's nice to look at every now and then. Now, on another different type of documentary about film or filmmaking or a specific film, let's take a look at Room 237. This is one that I watched a very long time ago, and I honestly don't remember if I ever talked about it in depth, but this is one that it's just fascinating, and it's the type of movie that I started watching, and I'm like going, this is ridiculous, but then at a certain point, you're like, wait a minute, wow, that is pretty interesting, and it's all about basically more or less conspiracy theories in terms of what really was meant by making this film. What I'm talking about is The Shining. What this documentary does is that it examines different people's interpretation of the movie The Shining, obviously based on the Stephen King novel. But this one is very special because it's Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. And what you end up getting here, and I can't get too deep into it because you just have to watch this movie. This is an excellent film. Is all these different versions of what certain film fans, people that actually like the film, think or theorize that the author or the artist, the director, was trying to convey to the viewer by staging things in a certain way and showing them in a certain manner. Now, I've never heard people going this in depth with other Stanley Kubrick films. I mean, you figure 2001 would probably be the best one because that's the craziest, trippiest one of all. But with The Shining, there is apparently theories about how Kubrick is trying to tell you the plight of the Native Americans by certain images that are being shown throughout the lodge, throughout the actual hotel. There's one that has to do with certain images of the Minotaur and how that's a prevailing theme in this particular story. Again, it is very trippy. It is very out there. There's another one that has to do with a film that he never got to make, about the Holocaust and how he's trying to kind of start to portray some of those elements, almost subliminally in it. But the craziest one that just kind of takes the cake, and the one that starts to make you think, it's like, oh yeah, look at that. There could be something there, which there's not, is the one about faking the moon landing. There's this great story that's been floating around for a long time about the faking of the moon landing. But this takes it a step further because it implies that Kubrick was actually the person in charge of filming and coming up with the realistic looking moon landing footage and all that stuff because of his fame of 2001, as if the government said, get me the guy who made 2001 and let's go fake a moon landing with Stanley Kubrick. And what this theory implies is that there's so many hints in the film of Kubrick kind of telling the viewers about all these moon landing related, space program related things that are happening in the film. Once again, this is a bizarre documentary, and it's the type of thing that, again, I went into it and I am like, this is just ridiculous. It is beautifully shot, and granted, a lot of it, they are using, obviously, Stanley Kubrick footage because they're showing you, they're comparing, they're running the film backwards and forwards and they're showing you all these different things. It's really entertaining. And you go through a certain period in the beginning of the movie where you're like, oh, this is just too much. I mean, what other crackpot theory are they going to throw? Oh, there's another crackpot theory. Okay, here's another. Okay, interesting. Okay, I see the connection. There's a connection there. But then as you get into the middle of it and they start to really get into the deep end of the crazy pool, man, are those really entertaining. And it's funny because we've talked about this in the past and we've approached it in a different manner. When it comes to Star Wars, there's previous episodes that I made a couple of episodes ago. I talked about how we like to theorize about things and how we like to rewrite the story about things and how we can come up with all these things. This is an extent of that kind of exercise, but it is taken to the extreme where by kind of rewriting it, people are believing it. They're coming up with their own, not only narrative, but reality narrative. They're coming up with these theories that are just so nutty, but entertaining. And that's how you can, and that's a way, I guess you can tell how, the conspiracy theory machine, that always pops up every now and then, succeeds a lot of times in staying in the longevity of it. I mean, we have people to this day that believe that the moon landing was fake. People believe the earth is flat. You got some really, really nutty things. And a lot of it is because it's entertaining, I imagine. And in this film, it's so cool how they show it to you. And if you have a group of 10 people, you're going to get some of them that are going to start scratching their head going, well, you know what? There might be something to this. But it's just great. And it's, again, this is a different kind of documentary. It is completely different. It is not, the type that, focuses on one person. It doesn't focus on the making of directly. It takes people's reaction to the film that's really, really interesting. And that is a theme that I'm finding that a lot of times there are documentaries that have to do with people's reaction to films. One of them that I just recently viewed that I thought it was completely different, and I ended up watching it anyway thinking it was something else, is called Chuck Norris versus Communism. I thought this was a documentary about all the crazy Chuck Norris films, which is not. This is not that documentary. I don't even know if that documentary exists. There's another one I'll talk about in a little bit that touches upon that just a little bit. But what this documentary does is it highlights and it interviews people from Romania, out of all places in the world, who during a certain period, not too long ago, that they were under a dictatorship, a very communist, hardline dictatorship. They were under very, very difficult situations. The unemployment and oppression and people spying on people and the government arresting people. Your typical, stereotypical kind of, communist bloc controlled country, Cold War, type of scenario. And what they do here is they highlight the fact that one of the things that was very illegal was watching Western films. And they talk about that there used to be this office where they would basically determine whether or not a film could be watched. And they have an office and they do recreations basically of them watching a thing. And all of a sudden they notice, okay, in this scene in this movie or this TV show, there's a kitchen and a family eating, but there's like a lot of food. And they're like, well, no, we can't show that, because if you show that, it implies that the West has so much food, and it could make people upset here if they see how other people in the world are more prosperous. So no, can't show this one. Can't show this one. They mentioned the word God or something like that. Oh, can't show that. No religion. They weren't allowing religion. So what the story tells you is about a black market underground system that they had of getting Western movies, American movies mainly, dubbing them in Romanian, and distributed them internally for people to watch, hidden from the government and from other people. And a lot of it is done through recreations. They do reenactments because obviously you don't have footage of that, but they do have some historical footage of the government and that sort of thing. And they do interview a lot of people that used to do these things. They used to, they talk about how they spent a ton of money trying to get a VCR because they were super expensive. Some people will bring them in from other countries, because they couldn't afford to buy them there. And how little by little they would get in contact with people who knew how to get these films. And it was almost like selling drugs in terms of a guy would show up with a suitcase and you would have, all of them obviously copied at somebody's house. They're not manufactured. They're not officially dubbed in that specific language. And, neighbors who trusted each other would gather in an apartment, like 15, 20 of them, all around a little tiny TV to watch something like The Terminator, or to watch, whatever popular movie of the time happens to be, coming into the country. Chuck Norris films, anything weird like that, like 80s, early 90s kind of stuff. Well, what they also show you in this documentary is that one of the things that a lot of these movies had in common is that they mainly used one voice to do all the dubbing. So in other words, there was a woman's voice that would dub all the characters in a movie. It wasn't like you had different actors, different voice actors playing different characters. No, it was one person. And it was kind of super, super rough because this one person is jumping from one character to the other. They're stepping over lines because they're kind of doing it on the fly, the way you're hearing it. And then they look into, then they show us how that was done. And they talk about how, this woman who used to work for the censor department, who was approached at one point to come in and do it, obviously risking going to jail. But her claim was that she just liked to watch movies. So that was the only way of her to be able to watch movies. Granted, she was getting paid to do it. So she would be brought into this home, somebody's house, this guy who was running the operation. And she would run the movie and talk into a microphone as the movie was happening, and then record it in another one. And then when you had a finished film of her translating the film, she tried to put as much dramatic emphasis as possible, but she wasn't an actress. She was just a translator, more or less. And again, she's doing every part of the movie. And because nothing is being edited, she's doing it, like I said earlier, on the fly. She's just talking as the movie's playing. And then I guess what happened is that would be mixed into another tape where you have, I guess, one channel would be the original movie's soundtrack. And then the other channel will be her translation. So when people are watching these tapes at home, they would get that thing. And I imagine her voice would be a little bit louder than this way you don't overpower each other. But it's funny because they were talking about how there are certain things she wouldn't do. She wouldn't curse, and she wouldn't get into too many sexual references, because that's like kind of like where she drew the line. So there were films like, for example, Scarface, which is a historically, strong language film, and how she tried to put her own sayings instead of curses in it. It sounds like a bad joke or bad, we've seen them before, how bad sometimes people try to cover up the cursing with putting other words that are non-offensive, which is very, very difficult. But one of the things we find out through this film is that the guy that's running the operation, this black market operation, every now and then he would almost get caught and then magically not get caught. So people would be theorizing, what's going on here? What's this guy doing? How is he getting away with this? And at certain points, the cops come in and they raid his place, and then all of a sudden he gives them like a certain word, and they all leave. So they're thinking maybe he works for the government. Maybe he is a government. Maybe he's here to arrest all of us. Maybe this is some kind of sting operation or something. And by the end of the film, you find out that he even had, because the system was so corrupt, that he had cops coming for him, to him for films. He had government officials. He says he even had the son of the president approach him indirectly to keep him supplied with movies. So he was giving everybody movies, selling them, to the point where they didn't want him to get caught because he was providing them with a service. And this is a typical scenario when it comes to these type of situations where that, yes, officially the black market is horrible and you can't buy these things. They're coming from the West, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, they're even getting it and profiting from it themselves. So it's an underground economy that was allowed to so more or less flourish. But yeah, they would catch people, at the tail end of it. They would arrest people and take their stuff away and that kind of thing. But they purposely did not mess with the guy too much because he was providing a service. And by the end of the documentary, we get to meet the actual individuals, because a lot of times this, like I said earlier, this was being portrayed by recreations, by actors, that sort of thing, reenactments. So this was an interesting, weird one, because it was kind of like, wow. And it's funny because a lot of people talk about how, one of the messages of the film is how even, underground videos of classic American films it was one of the things that would inspire people to revolt, if you will, to want to try something different, people that are oppressed and that sort of thing. How much weight can you put into that? Hard to tell. Dramatically in the documentary, I think they will try to put more of it than there is not, maybe. They show how kids, after watching some of these films, will go out and start play acting some of these roles. And that is not too uncommon. I would imagine that could happen. But I would also imagine that most people would be like, take it easy, cool it. Don't show too much. Don't let people know too much what you're doing, because, we're going to get in trouble for it, as some people have. So yeah, this was a really interesting, little weird one that I kind of stumbled on. Let me go down the list here a little more, because I know I promised I was going to be fast about this, but there's just so many good ones out there that I want you guys to be able to watch. Another one of these movies that never got made, Jodorowsky's Dune. This is a movie about a director a long time ago who's Chilean, who had done really, really weird artsy films. I think I might have seen one of them, which was a Western. A really strange guy. And he apparently was the first guy to get pretty far in trying to make a film out of the story of Dune, which later was done by David Lynch. What's amazing about this documentary is that there is so much conceptual work done. This is one of those films that, similar to the Superman film I was talking about earlier, because they had a director and because he had already started the process of pre-production and research and the art part of it, at least, he had gotten pretty far along in so much design work that was done that when they pulled the plug on it and then later on, they threw it on Lynch, it was something to remember. And this guy, I remember in the documentary, I saw this from a while back. He had this binder, this huge binder of artwork that is fantastic. And there's two things that you got to keep in mind about this film. This director is weird. He is a weird guy, super artsy. And in a way, when you look at the artwork and you look at the ideas that he had in mind, you kind of start to maybe understand why they chose Lynch later. Lynch almost feels like a lighter version of this guy. This guy, again, if you watch some of his other films, he is just completely out there. But the artwork was fantastic. He had gathered a whole bunch of artists, European artists, people like A.G. Geiger, this is before Alien we're talking about, to help come up with some of these designs. I believe Mobius might have been another one of these artists. Again, these are names that are very familiar when it comes to Alien. And what ended up happening was, even though the film was never made, a lot of these artists, and it's also possible that some of the producers or people involved in this film were also able to springboard from this failed attempt at making a film and were brought into Alien, because you do see a lot of this artwork, how it ends up in the Alien side. And it is just an incredible, thing to watch. And again, one of the takeaways, as far as I'm concerned, is that it's not so much, and this is true to a lot of these films that were never made, the whole process of how these films were never made. But one of the things they have in common, I think, is that when you look at the finished product or the potential finished product, it's not necessarily going to be a good film. And who can tell for sure? Nobody can tell. I mean, Hollywood executives, they're basically gambling, on this kind of thing. You have a good feeling about a director. You have a director with a good track record. Some of those factors are good in figuring out whether this movie is going to succeed or not. But you just can't tell. And when you listen to these people pitch their ideas, I could imagine that there are people that sound insane pitching whatever their crazy idea is, and the movie either is a complete disastrous failure or a super crazy blockbuster. I don't think there's a formula. It's just the way it goes. It goes one way, it goes the other way. You never really know, which way it's going to go. With that said, I'm listening to this guy and the kind of things he's talking about that he wants to do and the things he wants to portray, and knowing his history of the type of films he's done in the past, nothing that has kind of blown me away, at least the one I saw. It's really hard to kind of see him being able to pull this off. Granted, even though I have not seen all his films, he does, his track record is not that great, at least here in America. It is possible that for a European market or even a South American market, he might have a bigger, broad appeal, and it's a different kind of film. And I know that there are different standards, different tastes, cultural tastes, depending on where you live, what part of the world you're from. There are things that just don't translate well, when you bring them overseas. The Asian market is very different than the American market, than the European market, let's say. There's just different things that just sometimes don't translate well. But the thing that I love the most about this film is the amazing artwork that was being generated and how he was going to tell his story. It's one of those things that you're like, wow, if this film had been made, would it be a crazier version of Lynch, or would it be better, more cohesive? And I find that very, very hard to believe. I just find it very hard to believe that this finished film could have been something better than Dune. And I have a love-hate relationship with Lynch's Dune. There are things I love and there are things I hate. There's a pace that I despise. The way things are being told, it just doesn't work with me. There's so many confusing factors about the film, but it's one of these films that I can't let go. There's sometimes it'll be playing and I'll start watching it and I'm like, yeah, this is interesting. And it's like, oh, that's not good. But then it's like, oh, that's really interesting. It's a very, love it and hate it film at the same time. But I can't blame either one because I do love some of Lynch's work. And I do respect the power of the narrative, of the story of Dune. But something went wrong, and I have a feeling it would have gone wrong here too. When it comes to documentaries about filmmakers, where you tap into the making of certain films, but they kind of look at it more in a wider stance. It's more like a bio documentary. And there's a few of them that I watched. One of them is called De Palma, and one of them is called Milius. And this is about those two directors, Brian De Palma and John Milius. I watched De Palma because there's a couple of De Palma films that I absolutely love, especially Scarface. And there is very little, as far as I can tell, behind the scenes documentary making of type of material. But in the process of this one, you get to watch and you get to kind of go through his life. And one of the things that was really interesting in the movie, just like with the other one I'm going to talk about, Milius, is that, De Palma was part of that late 60s, early 70s San Francisco group, Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese, De Palma, Milius, those guys were those original directors that skyrocketed into fame, later on. But this one really gives you a good idea of his rapid ascension and then his more or less decline as a director. And so does Milius. Milius, I'm a huge fan of Conan the Barbarian, and that's one of his films. The documentary is really good because they talk about how his particular personality kind of influenced the films that he was interested in. While De Palma went into the Hitchcock side of horror and suspense and thrillers, which is an easy way to kind of pigeonhole De Palma, especially when he was first getting famous. Milius, on the other hand, kind of was like even though these are all very liberal individuals in college, he kind of took the conservative right-wingy side and made films like Red Dawn, very, pro-war-ish kind of John Wayne-y, if you will, kind of films. And Conan, very masculine, what it means to be a man, the physicalness, the strength, the brute force. And when you hear his interviews, he's really, really committed to these films. It's really amazing. And it's a really sad documentary because, by the end, you kind of start to understand that the man not only had to stop working, obviously he had his peak and then he had his decline, but then he suffered an illness that prevented from directing. And he had so many more potential movies in him that he could have been doing that he hasn't been able to. But again, it is a way of peeking into some of these favorite films of mine where there is no material, no really, really strong material, but by looking at the bio documentaries of the individuals, you can get a slight glance at that stuff. All right, a couple of other ones I would recommend. Hearts of Darkness. Hearts of Darkness is kind of like the granddaddy of a lot of these making of documentaries, not so much because it's your standard making of documentary, like I mentioned earlier, your Star Wars ones and the ones I talked about earlier that come usually with a DVD or that sort of thing. Hearts of Darkness was about how insanely difficult, maddening it was to make Apocalypse Now. This is obviously the famous Coppola film, one of his many famous films. But this particular one was chronicled in excruciating detail as to the conditions and all the things that went wrong and the recasting and just the nightmare scenario where the director himself seems to be kind of like losing his mind in the process. Similar to this one, I would say you can also have Burden of Dreams and My Best Fiend. These are films by Werner Herzog having to do with the making or the behind the scenes of some of his other films, specifically Fitzcarraldo. Fitzcarraldo was a film he made about this crazy guy who transports a boat like a steamship through the jungle. Not the water, the jungle, in order to bring it to another area because he wants to create like an opera house or something. Some weird, I forget exactly why, but it was an insane feat that he was trying to do. And the way that this film was made is also just as insane or even as insane as that in terms of trying to film this insanity. The other film, My Best Fiend, is more about the relationship between him and the star of the film, that how crazy the actor behaved at times and how much at each other's throats these two, director-actor, would be. It is just insane. I know I keep saying the word insane, but that's where these particular documentaries kind of fall under that, if you can even consider them a sub-genre of films that actually do exist, that were made, but so incredibly difficult to do them. Now, another angle that you can kind of take at the behind the scenes is not so much a behind the scenes making of, but a retrospective kind of a certain subgenre. Once again, what I'm talking about here is the grindhouse subgenre. This is something that's become very popular, after Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez, especially with, their collaborations and what happened afterwards, all the background stuff having to do, especially with Tarantino's work. There have been a lot of documentaries having to do with Grindhouse, and one of them is called American Grindhouse, and it does chronicle, what is this whole Grindhouse thing about? What were these films? These very low budget films. You kind of start dipping a little bit into Roger Corman territory, and even crazier than Roger Corman territory. So, from there, you can kind of jump to something I recently watched called Machete Maidens Unleashed. I know that sounds ridiculous, but it actually has a connection to Apocalypse Now, and it's about the grindhouse sexploitation type of films, from the 70s and that period of time that were directly influenced by the Philippines. And that's because, just like in Apocalypse Now, when they went to the Philippines to be able to shoot all these crazy films, in the case of Apocalypse Now, just like on a lot of other one of these much lower budget films, the country was very open for filming. They would even have the military cooperate in using military equipment and soldiers to be able to do some of these battle scenes. And, for a long period of time, they made a lot of money. They saved a lot of money by shooting in the Philippines. And that had become like a hotspot of filmmaking. Granted, the majority of it was complete trash in terms of some of these films, but it is really, really interesting where the roots of all of these subgenre films come from and the people that actually worked on them. Now, similar to that, you also have Not Quite Hollywood, the wild story of Ozploitation. What that means is that they're looking at, again, the sexploitation, blaxploitation, or whatever you want to call it, but it's the Australian version of it, because again, some of these countries, they have full-blown, film industries, and just like in our country, they have these, B tier and C tier levels of filmmaking that make a lot of money, and some of them do. Little by little, they kind of springboard into something a little bigger, and some of them actually do acquire, pretty well-known status. But underneath, for every one good film, you probably have about 75 awful ones. And that's one of the things that they kind of represent here, is giving you the background of that sort of thing. Now, with the original intent that I had on watching that Chuck Norris documentary, one that actually touches upon it a little bit more is called Electric Boogaloo, The Wild Untold Story of Canon Films. This is a really good one because it talks about how you have a studio that is really it's a kind of like an in-between studio, let's say. A studio that is slightly above the Roger Corman factory of filmmaking, but below the top-tier Hollywood, mainstream, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, Warner Bros., that kind of stuff. Somewhere in the between that, and that was Canon Studios. And for a long time, they were able to make a number of films that they weren't exactly blockbusters, but they kind of kept the studio afloat, and they made sufficiently, enough money, and they would attract a certain caliber, if you will, of actors. But not until all of a sudden they had some hits on their hands that they started kind of playing a little bit with the big boys. So, for example, they did have a lot of junk in there, a lot of, B-level movies, but they had Chuck Norris, and they made a ton of films with him, made the man, a star. Granted, his films, they're typical shoot 'em up, the guy's the modern version of Clint Eastwood, if you will, the man with no name type of character. That's the persona that Chuck Norris kind of took and has, exploited and made money out of it in his entire life. However, with Canon, what happened was that they got into a situation where they actually made a couple of pretty successful films. Some of the pretty B-level films that probably fall under this studio would include things like some of the Death Wish films, the Ninja films, Bolero, if you remember that. The Missing in Action films, again, going back to the Chuck Norris material. Invasion USA, Life Force, The Delta Force, Superman 4, Cyborg. Of course, Breaking 2, Electric Boogaloo, which is what part of this documentary is named after. Lambada, where they try to recreate the magic of the latest dance craze. Invaders from Mars, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. There's a lot of stuff. Masters of the Universe. You guys remember that? Again, with this particular movie, it was with, I think it might have been with Breaking. That's the one that probably, got them thinking that they were into something big. And, for a brief period, you got to remember also studios like, for example, New Line Cinema at the time were studios that were kind of, again, flying under the radar. And then all of a sudden they get a big hit with like Nightmare on Elm Street. So all of a sudden they become players. They're actual players in the game. But with Canon, this is what, these guys were kind of pumping out at the time. And, they made a pretty good living out of it. There's actually another documentary that I would mention having to do with the same story of, the behind the scenes Canon, especially the two brothers, the Golan brothers, who were the ones that ran Canon for a very long time. It's called The Go-Go Boys, the inside story of Canon Films. I think between those two documentaries, you can probably get a really good feel of what these, mid-level studios were like at the time, of these type of films. Again, these kind of films, they're cheesy, they're bad, but they're kind of like comfort food. They're candy. They're guilty pleasures, if you will. But those are two really good documentaries about that. Now, there's also a lot of documentaries out there. If you're in, again, when you go to the grindhouse side, you also kind of start overlapping with the martial arts side. And there's a number of documentaries about the history of martial art films. One that I would point out to you that might be easy to find, it's called The Art of Action Martial Arts in Motion Picture. This one's narrated by Samuel Jackson, and it's really cool because, first of all, he is a fan, I believe, of traditional martial arts films, going back to the Shaw Brothers and all that kind of stuff. Nowadays, I have a channel here. It's funny because when I first moved to Florida, before moving to Florida, when I was visiting, I was watching cable at my parents' house, and all of a sudden they have El Rey Network, which is a network that I didn't have back up north in Jersey under my, Verizon Fios I used to have in Jersey. Here I have Xfinity, which is Comcast. And it's like, wow, this channel is great. They were showing martial arts films. They were showing repeats of like Knight Rider and Star Trek and Buck Rogers and, really weird retro-y kind of stuff. But they did go crazy with the martial art films. And when I finally moved here, I was like, that's it. I don't care whatever company it is that's available. As long as it has El Rey Network, that's what I'm getting. So I ended up getting it. And yes, it's great because any time of the day you can usually find some classic martial arts films, the type of stuff that I used to watch when I was young, not in the movie theater because I wasn't part of that crowd, but on either Channel 5 or Channel 11, our syndicated channels, syndicated independent channels. Saturday. It was Saturday afternoon, I believe. They would show, some channels would show some crazy, again, B-level sci-fi stuff, and then you had Kung Fu Theater, I think it was called, or something like that, which was like one or two karate films, martial art films, back to back. And it's an entire world. I mean, there are so many different famous directors within the genre, obviously. But these documentaries, just like this one that I'm mentioning, the one that's hosted by Samuel Jackson, you start to see all of these influences in modern films, even in the last 20 years, that take their cues originally from these older films, modern stuff like John Woo films, The Matrix, all kinds of stuff like that, more super modernly great films like The Raid, and all of this new style martial arts that are that starts to kind of percolate into movies here or there. It's like, ooh, all these different weird fighting styles. Hey, guess what? They're all coming, from this older version of filmmaking, very different, somewhat cheesy at times, but it's, it's a whole other culture. But wow, there's some real good stuff out there. And I definitely, like I said, there's many of them out there, but that's one that could probably open the floodgates for you. Now, if your taste is a little more in the musical side of filmmaking, there was one documentary I saw called Score, a film music documentary. And again, this is one that gives you the basics of what is the purpose of the score, who are the players these days, what is the history of some of the bigger players in the past, but how, influential, how important it is, the score of a film, where you a lot of times kind of throw it in the background. No pun intended, it's in the background. But, how the process works and all that stuff. Again, another great, very niche kind of examination of one little aspect of just typical filmmaking. There's a couple more that I have not seen yet, and I am going to try to work on seeing them, so maybe one day I could review them. One of them is Full Tilt Boogie, which is the making of From Dusk Till Dawn, which is, again, the Tarantino-Rodriguez collaboration. And then there's the one called The Shark Is Still Working, which is about the making of Jaws. And from what I understand, that's also a very, very good documentary, chronicling all the crazy happenings with that mechanical shark that we all love. Oh, and one more I want to add that I did see, one called Back in Time, and I might have mentioned it before when I did my Back to the Future special. This is one that, again, it's a typical making of, happy making, but what makes it a little different as far as Back to the Future is that they were able to use a lot of the footage of the Eric Stoltz scenes that were shot before Michael J. Fox took over that role. Granted, it has some kind of shaky elements, when it comes to the fan side of the film, where they kind of spend a little too much time on that. However, they do get some of the heavy hitters of the film to participate, and they do get their hands on, are able to show, some of these different scenes that were shot and how different of a tone you start to feel the film would have had if they would have kept Eric Stoltz and not Michael J. Fox. Again, if you're more interested in Back to the Future, I suggest listening to that other episode that I did, because it does have a lot of the behind-the-scenes story of what actually went wrong with that particular actor. So anyway, I gave you guys a ton of options here when it comes to documentaries, and specifically, like I said, documentaries that are a little different than your standard straight documentary. A real amount of good stuff here. A lot of this I was able to find on Netflix, Amazon Prime, the internet, YouTube. A lot of this stuff is out there. It doesn't really take a brain surgeon to figure it out how to get them and, be able to see them. So hopefully I'll return at some point with some more documentaries. All right, well, I hope everybody enjoyed today's show. We took a look at quite a number of film documentaries, all of them taking different views and different approaches having to do with a specific film. So you have plenty to pick from, and I'm sure that we're going to have much more in the future, hopefully enough to make another show out of it and be able to recommend them to you. So, on behalf of everybody here at our show, thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon here at GeekFest Rants. Bye-bye, everybody.
Mi ambición fue tremenda. I wanted to make something sacred, una película que diera las alucinaciones de LSD. Si tomara LSD to change the young mind of all the world. Michel Siduk said to me, I want to make a new picture with you. What do you want to do? I say, Dune. And he said, yes.
C'était le plus beau livre de science-fiction, c'est la Bible de la science-fiction, succès d'édition mondiale.
I didn't read Dune, but I have a friend who said it was fantastic. 3,000 drawings. I shoot the picture, point of view, movement of the camera, dialogue.
Designing the spaceships, the clothes, the whole look of his world.
The castle. Open the mouth. The spaceship came in the tongue.
His vision was so huge, so beyond what anybody else was doing at that time. Things that George Lucas wasn't even going to try with Star Wars. It's enormous.
Part of Holler's genius was finding the right people.
David Carradine, Mick Jagger. Dali as the mad emperor of the galaxy.
Dali said, can I have a burning giraffe? All right, we'll have burning giraffe.
Orson Welles. Yeah, I say, I don't want to do it. I say, if you do the picture, I will hire the chef of the restaurant and you will eat as here every day. And I say, I do it. Giger nunca había hecho películas. I say to Giger, I need you as you are.
Alejandro completely motivated you. It was wonderful.
We will change the world.
People did not do this film because they were afraid of his imagination.
This is a movie that has its fingerprints all over so many other movies. Blade Runner, William Gibson, Matrix.
Giger, he make the monster of Alien. And Hollywood start to use my group.
It always leads back to Jodorowsky.
Could be fantastic, no?
If you would like to subscribe to our show, send us messages, or see video links to some of the topics we talked about today, please visit our homepage at geekfestrants.com or our YouTube channel, Facebook page, or iTunes at GeekFest Rants.
I don't know what we're yelling about!
GeekFest Rants is produced by Carlos Perone, copyright 2018.
This broadcast is part of the IC Robots Radio Network. Visit icrobots.com for this and many other nerd/nostalgia related podcasts. You won't be sorry for long.